Rain had already found its way through the stitched seams of Victoria Schmidt's thin kid slippers when the Marworth carriage turned into Stall Street, and by then each step beside the wheel sent a bright, punishing sting up her left ankle, where leather had stripped the skin raw. She balanced the hat box with one gloved hand and kept the lavender shawl gathered in the other, careful not to let either brush the mud while Lady Marworth and her daughters rode dry behind glass. Gaslight threw weak circles across the paving stones. Horses steamed in the wet. The evening crowd parted for painted coaches, and did not part for the girl walking beside one. Men in dark wool looked once, and then looked away. Two women under a striped umbrella watched the blood mark her slipper, and turned their conversation toward ribbon prices, as if she were a passing post. Victoria kept her chin level. She had learned that a lowered head invited pity, and pity was only another way strangers reminded her she had fallen. Cold rain slid down the back of her neck and under her collar. Her fingers had gone stiff around the hatbox ribbon long before they reached the assembly rooms, but she did not ask to ride the final stretch. She was 22 years old. She was called plain often enough that even maids repeated it. Her dark hair was pinned too tightly, her face too thin, her eyes too large. Stillness was the one luxury no one could confiscate, and she wore it like a mantle. At the great door, a footman in Marworth colours took the hat-box from her without meeting her gaze, then passed it directly to Miss Clara Marworth with a bow deep enough to mock gravity itself. Victoria followed through the servants' passage, gave the lavender shawl to Lady Marworth's maid, and waited for instruction while heat from a coal brazier rose in waves she was not invited to share. Lady Marworth entered moments later in watered blue silk and pearl drops that trembled when she spoke. Her perfume moved before her, rose water sharpened with something bitter. She did not greet Victoria by name. She touched the edge of her own glove and said, in a tone smooth as polished silver, "Stand near the second pillar in the upper gallery. If Miss Clara tears her lace again, mend it. If Miss Anne drops her fan, retrieve it. If anyone asks, you are my husband's distant relation who insists on being useful." She paused only to let the insult settle where bystanders could hear it. A matron near the mirror lifted one brow and pretended to inspect her daughter's sleeve. Lady Marworth lowered her voice by a degree that did not make it kind. "Do not be seen unless needed. Do not eat from the buffet. Do not speak unless spoken to." Victoria inclined her head. The answer expected of her had long ago worn itself into habit. "Yes, Lady Marworth." She received no acknowledgement. The rustle of silk moved away, trailing privilege and warmth and invitation, and left her in the narrow draught between corridor and ballroom, where lamps smoked and servants hurried with trays. By the first hour after 9, her feet had gone from pain to numbness and back again. Music rose and fell beneath the painted ceiling. Laughter broke in bright clusters from groups of young women whose gloves had never been mended twice. Victoria stood behind the carved pillar assigned to her and stitched a split seam in Clara's cuff, by candlelight too dim for close work, guiding the needle through expensive lace with hands that shook only when no one watched directly. She had eaten half a heel of stale bread in the scullery at noon, nothing since. The smell of roast pheasant, sugared almonds, warm wine thick with clove, all of it drifted toward her in intervals cruel enough to feel deliberate. A passing servant offered her a tray by mistake, then withdrew it when he recognized her dress, a dove-grey muslin washed until it had forgotten it was ever fine. She carried warmed wine to Lady Marworth's circle twice, and received each time a correction spoken lightly for the entertainment of others. "Not that side, child, you drip." Then later, "Your gloves are shocking, Miss Schmidt. One might mistake you for a hired girl." A soft laugh from someone with diamonds at her throat. Victoria set the cup down without spilling and stepped back into shadow. Her father had once told her that numbers were a language no man could steal if she kept them precise. In his study, before fever took him in a week, and debt collectors came before the earth on his grave had settled, she had copied ledgers in English, French, and German, row after row of cargo weights and insurance marks, his broad hand beside her narrow one. Those evenings had smelled of ink and sealing wax and cedar. After his burial, Lady Marworth had the study locked. After 3 days, his portrait was removed from the hall. After a month, Victoria was told she occupied space she did not finance. She moved as instructed and as needed, and nowhere by choice. She knelt in a side antechamber to pin Anne Marworth's hem, while Anne complained to a friend that Bath had grown provincial, then rose too quickly and steadied herself against the wall before carrying a fresh ribbon to the dressing table. She fetched smelling salts for a dowager who had overheated herself near the crush by the musicians. She held the basin while a maid dabbed at spilled syllabub on Clara's skirt. She was visible only as hands. At one point a young gentleman asked, without looking fully at her face, whether she knew where he might find the card-room. "Down the west corridor, sir," she said. He thanked the wall beyond her shoulder and walked on. Near midnight, a child in satin shoes began to cry in the lower hall because her mother had left her with a nurse and forgotten to return. Victoria crouched to the child's height, wiped jam from the girl's fingers with her own handkerchief, and spoke quietly until the nurse appeared, flustered and apologetic. No one marked it. No one was meant to. Her own knuckles had split where the wet glove had rubbed against skin. She folded her fingers into her palms so blood would not stain the cuff and bring another public correction. Across the room, Lady Marworth caught her eye and smiled, the way one smiles at a servant who has remembered the fire irons. By the second week of October, Bath had settled into that particular damp cold that found the lungs and lingered there, and tonight it had entered the assembly rooms with every opening of the doors. Victoria felt it each time she crossed from heated ballroom to draught-lined corridor, felt it cling to her wet hem and rise through threadbare stockings. The orchestra struck a country dance. Couples took their places under chandeliers that scattered light like broken frost. She remained by the pillar, then by the mantel, then by the sideboard, according to the silent angle of Lady Marworth's fan. When Clara laughed too loudly, Victoria appeared with a fresh handkerchief. When Anne sulked because a captain had chosen another partner, Victoria brought lemon water and accepted blame for the wrong shade of ribbon, though she had not selected it. Her name was used as reprimand and caution. "Do not stand like Miss Schmidt." "Do not fade your complexion like Miss Schmidt." "Do not forget gratitude as she does." None of it was spoken privately. That was the method. Humiliation performed for witnesses became truth by repetition. In the long mirror opposite the musicians, she caught a brief reflection of herself between moving couples. Narrow shoulders, damp curls, escaping pins. Eyes dark from fatigue. Mouth set in a line too old for her years. Plain, they said. They were not entirely wrong. Beauty in that room belonged to silk, to inheritance, to girls who could afford softness. When the supper interval came, guests moved toward tables laid with silver covers and white linen. Victoria was sent the other direction to the service corridor with a list she did not need written. Collect more pins, find the black silk fan Clara abandoned, mend a torn glove, heat wine, carry messages. The kitchen was a riot of steam and shouted orders. She stood aside until cook waved her toward a tray of cups and looked at her with one quick, practical pity that asked no questions. "Take this while it is hot, miss," Cook murmured, then pretended not to notice when Victoria steadied herself against the dresser before lifting the weight. On the return, passing a half-open door, she saw Lady Marworth seated among 3 matrons, wrist glittering with bracelets, voice low and cutting. "My husband insists we keep her," she was saying. "One cannot abandon every obligation of a previous marriage. Still, one does what one can. She is useful with a needle." A pause, then, with a small laugh, "and mercifully invisible." The women around her made the sympathetic sounds of those congratulating themselves for endurance they had never needed. Victoria did not stop. She carried the tray into the bright room and set each cup where instructed. Her stomach turned at the scent of broth she would not taste. Her shoulders burned from holding composure in place. The music resumed, another set assembled. She took her station behind the pillar again, one hand hidden in her skirt to press against the bleeding place at her heel, and stood as if carved there, a useful ghost in her father's city, while rain tapped against the high windows like a hand that had been knocking all night and had not yet been answered. Rain tapped at the high windows. Violins climbed and fell. Victoria kept her place by the pillar and counted the bars to keep her face still, because if she let the music carry her for even a moment, she would remember too clearly that she had once been taught to dance in this very room, when her father still lived and people still said Miss Schmidt with respect instead of amusement. She had been 12 then, all elbows and earnest concentration, her slippers new, her gloves too large at the fingertips. Herr Lehmann, the dancing master, had tapped a cane near her shoes and told her to trust the line of her spine. Her father had watched from the edge of the floor, laughing when she missed a turn and nearly collided with a potted palm. He had clapped anyway. He had clapped as if awkwardness itself were a promise. That memory did not arrive gently. It struck like cold water. She shifted the pressure on her bleeding heel and fixed her eyes on the knot of matrons near the card tables until the old image steadied and became bearable. Her father had built his fortune in ships and freight insurance, not in land. Men whose coats smelled of salt and tar had once stood in their hall at all hours with ledger books tucked under their arms and news from Lisbon, Hamburg, and the Levant. The study fire burned late in those years. Wax pooled and hardened in rings on polished wood. She had sat beside him with a stool under her feet, translating invoices from German hands too ornate for clerks to decipher quickly, reading French correspondence aloud when his head ached, adding columns while rain battered the panes and the harbour bells rolled through the dark. He had never spoken to her as if she were ornamental. He had spoken to her as if she were necessary. "Again," he would say, sliding a page toward her. "If the sum is wrong once, a man can call it accident. If it is wrong twice, he calls it fraud." She had learned precision and silence, and the weight of signatures. She had learned that numbers carried moral force when witnesses lied. She had learned, without understanding yet how costly it would become, that records survived moods. Then fever came in early spring, ordinary at first and then not ordinary at all. He returned from Bristol damp from travel, dismissed supper, and asked for blankets in a voice roughened by chill. By morning his skin burned. By the 3rd day he no longer recognised the room. She had sat at his bedside with vinegar cloths and prayer cards, and a physician who kept promising the crisis would break at dawn. Dawn came and did not break anything. On the 7th day the house was quiet in a way she had never known. A clock in the corridor struck every quarter hour too loudly. Servants moved as if carrying glass. She remembered the exact pattern of dust on the stair runner, because she had stared at it while strangers measured curtains for mourning drapery. She remembered the smell of lilies, dense enough to choke, and the scrape of chairs in the dining room where men spoke of liabilities as if grief were an inconvenience to the proper ordering of accounts. She was 17, black dress pinned at the throat, hands steady from habit rather than strength. At the churchyard, wet earth clung to her hem. She did not weep there. She could not afford spectacle. She saved tears for the lock she turned herself that evening on his study door, because she believed she was preserving him. Debt did not wait for mourning. Creditors arrived before the black crape was removed from the front knocker. Some were patient men who had sailed with her father's captains and touched their hats to her in the passage. Some were not patient at all, cargo lost in a storm, an underwriter gone bankrupt in London, a warehouse fire no one had predicted. 3 shocks in one season had thinned what should have remained secure. Her father had told her enough over winter that she understood the broad shape of danger, but he had not lived to close the gaps. For 6 weeks she met with the family solicitor at the dining table and watched him sort papers into piles marked recoverable and unrecoverable. She sold 2 silver epergnes and did not announce it. She dismissed the French tutor and copied correspondence herself. She reduced coal deliveries. She walked through rooms at night counting what could be let, what could be pawned, what could be spared without inviting gossip that would lower the value of what remained. None of it would have destroyed them, not yet. They stood on a narrow ridge, wind hard on both sides, but standing still. Lady Marworth entered their lives as rescue and stayed as occupation. She came not as Mr. Schmidt's bride, but as Mrs. Marworth. Secure in the authority her marriage to Mr. Marworth gave her over the obligations attached to Victoria after her father's death. She was connected, practical, and skilled in the art of sounding benevolent while calculating advantage. Her daughters, Clara and Anne, arrived with trunks that required 2 footmen each, and complaints that arrived even faster. At first it was all civility. Lady Marworth called Victoria dear child in front of visitors and praised her composure. She brought introductions Victoria needed and sat with her at the solicitor's table as if solidarity itself were a dowry. Within 3 months she had persuaded Mr. Marworth that every Schmidt account, key and decision must be consolidated under Marworth management for the girls' protection. He signed the authorizations. She enforced them. By Michaelmas, the ink on those papers was scarcely dry when the household order changed. Keys moved, locks changed. Staff who had served since Victoria's infancy were given references and sent away for economy, while Lady Marworth's own people filled the vacancies and looked through her as if she were furniture that did not match the room. The first room taken from her was not her chamber, but the study. Lady Marworth stood in the doorway with a bunch of keys at her wrist and said the books must be reviewed by professionals, that unmarried girls had no business among legal papers, that she herself would protect Victoria from the vulgar burden of commerce. The words were honeyed. The intention was iron. Victoria asked for 1 ledger, then 2, then her father's dictionary, with his annotations in the margin. Lady Marworth smiled and said, "In due course." Due course never came. The ledgers vanished into locked cabinets in the west wing. The dictionary disappeared. The portrait that had hung above the mantel, her father in dark coat, with one hand resting on a rolled chart, was removed one afternoon while she accompanied the apothecary to settle a bill. When she asked where it had gone, Clara said lightly that the frame had clashed with the wallpaper, and laughed when Victoria went pale. Later she found the portrait face down in a storeroom behind broken screens, canvas scratched at one corner where a crate had scraped it. She cleaned the dust from his cheek with the edge of her apron and carried the image to the attic herself, breathing through the splinters in the stair rail because rage offered no practical remedy. By the first winter after that transfer of authority, her place in the house had been reduced to a list of permissions. She could sit in the morning room only when no guests were expected. She could not use the pianoforte after noon because Anne found scales fatiguing. She could borrow books from the circulating library only if Clara approved the titles, and Clara approved almost none. She could dine with the family when callers were absent. Otherwise, she was instructed to eat in the schoolroom on the pretext that table numbers required management. Her allowance was suspended pending review. Her gowns were altered twice over and then passed to servants when Lady Marworth declared them unfashionable. New gloves were denied because old ones could be mended. Candles in her chamber were counted. Firewood was measured. If she spoke at dinner and contradicted Clara even gently on a point of fact, Lady Marworth corrected her in the tone reserved for children, and said gratitude would improve her complexion. If she remained silent, Anne remarked that silence could resemble sulking in plain women. There was no version of conduct that did not earn censure. That was the architecture. One wall at a time, one rule at a time, one humiliation placed where witnesses could confirm it. Cruelty settled into routine, banal, and relentless. Lady Marworth withheld breakfast when she judged Victoria had answered too slowly the night before. Clara borrowed her ribbons and returned them stained with pomade. Anne sent her out in rain for parcels she had no intention of using. On market mornings, Lady Marworth would hand her a basket too heavy for one arm and walk half a pace ahead, discussing household economies loudly enough for stall-holders to hear. Once, when Victoria corrected a fishmonger's false weight out of old habit and precise eye, Lady Marworth struck her wrist with a folded parasol in the middle of Milsom Street and said, with a smile fixed for public consumption, "You forget yourself." The bruise lasted 9 days. The fishmonger looked down at his scales and said nothing. So did everyone else. Bath was a city skilled at observing rank and calling it discretion. Victoria learned to keep her hands inside her sleeves when possible. The debts were used as leash and sermon, both. Lady Marworth spoke often of sacrifice. She spoke of bills she had paid, creditors she had soothed, invitations she had secured to preserve the family's position. She did not mention that she had sold a parcel of warehouse shares at discount to a cousin and routed the proceeds through accounts no one had authorised Victoria to inspect. She did not mention that dowry funds designated in Mr. Schmidt's will for his daughter's settlement remained inaccessible under legal delays she herself encouraged. At 19, Victoria understood enough from overheard names and mismatched totals to suspect manipulation, but suspicion without papers was simply insolence in a dependent woman. She began then to salvage what evidence she could without alerting the wrong people. Receipts left on trays, correspondence drafts in ash baskets not fully burned, a copied figure here, a date there, tucked into the lining of a work basket beneath spools of dull thread. Each fragment by itself was trivial. Together they formed a pattern she did not yet dare present. She lived on that pattern as others lived on hope. Only 2 people in the house treated her history as fact rather than inconvenience. One was old Mr. Penry, her father's coachman, whose knees had stiffened but whose memory remained exact. He called her Miss Victoria even when others listened, and once slipped her a folded note listing the names of 2 creditors already paid whom Lady Marworth still invoked at table as active threats. The other was Mrs. Davies in the still-room, who pretended to scold when she found Victoria reading by the pantry lamp after midnight, and then left a cup of broth where no one would remark it. Their kindness never arrived as sentiment. It arrived as information, extra stitches, doors left unlatched at useful hours. Quiet loyalties survived in corners where power seldom looked. She guarded those loyalties fiercely. If Lady Marworth guessed the extent of them, she would have dismissed both without hesitation and called it prudent management. A burst of applause from the ballroom snapped Victoria back to the present. A set had ended. Gentlemen bowed. Fans fluttered open like pale wings. Her shoulders ached from holding the tray level for the last quarter hour. Blood had dried tacky inside her left slipper. She shifted the weight again and kept her face composed, while Clara swept past in cream silk and stopped just close enough for her perfume to sting. "You have pinned this cuff too tightly," Clara said, extending one arm as if addressing a maid she did not quite trust to lace boots. "Do it again, quickly. Lord Pembroke has asked for the next dance." Victoria unpicked the stitch with numb fingers and redid it with precise tension. Clara watched her a moment, then lowered her voice. "Mother says you stared at the supper table like a beggar. Do try to remember who pays for your bread." She moved away before an answer could compromise the scene. There was no need to reply. The statement had never been meant as conversation. It had been meant as placement. The orchestra began to tune for the final sequence. Outside, rain thickened against the panes, soft and relentless. Inside, wax smoke curled toward painted plaster, where shepherdesses and clouds remained forever untouched by weather. Victoria carried a tray of empty glasses through the side passage and paused as two footmen lifted a crate from a service cart that had just come from Marworth House. One lid had sprung at the corner. Through the gap she saw the gilt edge of a familiar frame and the dark brushwork of a shoulder she knew better than any face in Bath. Her father's portrait, not in the attic where she had hidden it, packed among candelabra and old drapery as if ready for sale. Her throat tightened hard enough to hurt. She set the tray down before it shook. "Where is that bound?" she asked, and kept her tone level because panic invited questions. The younger footman shifted his grip and answered without malice. "To the dealer on Broad Street by morning, miss. Lady Marworth's order. Old pieces only." Old pieces. The word landed like an insult spoken over a grave. Victoria looked at the crate, at the split board, at the painted shoulder vanishing back into shadow as the men carried it toward the loading door. The years of small thefts and public corrections and managed hunger gathered themselves into a single clean point inside her chest. She lifted the tray again. Her fingers no longer trembled. She turned toward the ballroom where Lady Marworth waited beneath chandeliers and music, and for the first time that night stillness did not feel like armour. It felt like a blade kept sheathed one breath longer. She crossed the threshold into the ballroom, with the tray held level, and the pulse in her throat beating hard enough to blur the edges of the chandeliers. Lady Marworth stood near the musicians with Clara on one side and Anne on the other, all three arranged in a pool of candlelight as if they had been painted there. Silk whispered when Lady Marworth turned. Her gaze slid over the tray, then fixed on Victoria's face and sharpened at whatever she found there. She did not call aloud. She made one small movement with her fan, a signal practiced for years, and Victoria obeyed it because refusal in public would cost other people first. In the narrow passage behind the orchestra stand, where the violins swallowed lesser sounds, and no guest of rank would linger, Lady Marworth snapped the fan shut and struck Victoria lightly beneath the chin with the lacquered edge. The gesture was almost affectionate. The words were not. "Your stare is becoming a habit, Miss Schmidt. Correct it." She reached to Clara's bodice, touched the line of diamonds, and hissed through a smile made for passers-by. "The clasp is gone. My daughter noticed it 2 minutes ago. She was in the winter garden for air. You will retrieve it now." Victoria opened her mouth to ask where, precisely, and Lady Marworth leaned closer until rosewater and clove crushed the breath from her chest. "Do not return without it, and hear me well. If you fail, Mr. Penry is dismissed at dawn. No reference, no lodging. The street will have him by morning." The threat landed cleanly, not shouted, not theatrical, merely placed where it would do the most damage. Victoria looked past Lady Marworth's shoulder and saw Mr. Penry at the far wall, through the gap between moving couples, old back, straight in borrowed livery, waiting for another order he had not earned. She swallowed once. "Yes, Lady Marworth." Lady Marworth reopened her fan in one smooth motion and stepped back into light, already laughing at something a baronet's wife had said. Victoria turned away with no tray now to steady her hands, and moved toward the side doors while the room spun with satin and applause. At 11:30 the musicians were already setting the pages for the final waltz. The winter corridor took her from heat into glass and draught in 6 steps. Her damp hem chilled instantly. Orange trees in heavy tubs lined the walls, their leaves dark and glossy under weak lamps. Rain ticked over the roof above in 1,000 thin strikes. She went to her knees beside the first marble bench and searched between chair legs, beneath fern fronds, along cracks in the tile where candle wax had pooled. Nothing. She rose, limped to the next alcove and searched again. Her heel burned. Her fingers had gone clumsy from cold. At the far end of the gallery a door banged once in the wind and rebounded against its latch with a hollow thud. Then came a second sound, not wind, a short, broken gasp. She followed it past a stone urn and found the boy crumpled on his side in the narrow space between an iron plant stand and the wall, one small hand pressed to his chest, the other open on glittering fragments of crystal. A smashed lamp globe lay beside him. His skin was grey under the candle glow. His lashes were wet, whether with rain or tears she could not tell. He tried to draw breath and failed halfway, a rasping catch that tightened every muscle in her body at once. Victoria dropped beside him, skirts in the water, and slid one arm behind his shoulders. "Look at me," she said low and firm. "Do not fight it. Slow!" His eyes found her face and widened with the blind panic of a child who could not pull air where air should have been. Blood welled from a slice across his palm and ran bright over his fingers. She tore the loose strip from her petticoat hem with both hands, wrapped it hard around the wound, and pressed until the flow eased. Her own glove dragged across a shard. Pain flashed along the base of her thumb. She ignored it. "Good," she told him. "Again. Breathe with me. In for 4. Hold out." He shook his head violently, chest hitching. She set her palm between his shoulder blades and counted for him anyway, numbers steady as hammer strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the 3rd cycle he managed a fuller breath, then coughed hard against her sleeve. She shifted him upright against her knees, careful of his spine, and felt the bones of him through damp velvet. 6 years old at most, too slight, too frightened, no nurse in sight, no footman, no one. The door at the corridor end opened with force. Boots struck tile. She didn't turn until the shadow reached them, broad and black against the lamplight. "Do not move him." The voice was male, cold, accustomed to obedience. Victoria looked up from the child and found a tall man framed by rain and darkness, great coat unbuttoned, water beading on his shoulders and running from the edge of his jaw, dark hair, no powder, face cut in hard lines as if carved with a blunt knife, eyes the colour of deep water in winter, fixed first on the boy, then on the strip of cloth in her blood-wet hand, then on her, the Duke of Ashbourne, Lord Elias Thornfield, who had danced every woman in the room and passed her, as if she were part of the wall. She tightened her hold on the boy as another breath caught in his throat. "Then summon hot water and leave me room to keep him breathing." His gaze sharpened at the defiance. For a heartbeat she thought he would drag rank across her like a blade and call servants to remove her. Instead, he stepped past her shoulder in 2 strides, opened the corridor door, and thundered into the passage. "Maddox! Now! Hot water! Towels! Send for Dr. Hale!" He shut the door again and came back, kneeling opposite her on the wet tile, without regard for his coat. Up close he looked less like a ballroom ornament and more like a man built for weather and war. Large hands, scar at one knuckle, jaw set hard enough to show strain along the cheek. He spoke to the child. "Julian, look at me." The boy's eyes flickered from Victoria to him. "Uncle," he whispered, then bent forward with another tight cough. So this was Julian, his nephew. The name passed through the room all season in lowered voices, always wrapped in pity and strategy. Orphaned young, delicate lungs, heir to half a county if he survived to manhood. Victoria had heard enough to recognise the shape of that burden. She had not expected to feel its weight in her lap. "Keep him upright," she said. "Not flat. He is drawing better this way." The Duke's stare cut to her face, measuring whether she knew what she was doing or merely pretended. She met it without lowering her eyes. "If he cannot clear his chest, he will worsen." "You are giving orders in my house's name." "We are not in your house, Your Grace. We are in a corridor with a child who cannot breathe." Her mouth tightened. Not quite anger, not quite assent. He shifted closer, one knee on the stone, and set a hand lightly behind Julian's neck where she indicated. The child leaned into both of them at once, small body trembling in waves. Victoria continued counting breaths under her breath until the pattern steadied enough for words. "What frightened you?" she asked Julian. He swallowed air in shallow pools. "Glass fell. I ran. Could not find Nanny." His lip shook. "I dropped Aunt Clara's jewel." So the clasp had been here. Lady Marworth had told one truth tonight. A footman burst in with a basin steaming in both hands, followed by another with folded cloth. Maddox, broad and red-faced, halted at the sight of the Duke kneeling in pooled rainwater, and looked briefly as if he had entered the wrong world. "Your Grace." "Set it down," Thornfield said, "and shut the door." Victoria rinsed crystal dust from Julian's palm, picked out 2 tiny slivers with the tip of a hairpin heated in the basin water, and bound the hand with fresh linen. The boy flinched once and bit down on the cry. "Brave," she said quietly. "That is enough." She held the warm cloth near his mouth to moisten the air and had him breathe through it, while the Duke watched every movement as if memorising a drill. Dr. Hale arrived in less than 2 minutes, coat half-buttoned, spectacles fogged, medical bag striking his leg as he hurried. He examined Julian, listened to his chest, nodded once at Victoria's position of the child and at the steaming cloth. "Well managed," he murmured, then administered a measured draught from a vial. "Spasm! Likely from fright and cold. The hand will heal. He must be kept from noise tonight and from damp air." He straightened and addressed the Duke with formal gravity. "He was fortunate to be found at once." Thornfield did not thank him. He simply said, "You will remain until he sleeps." Dr. Hale bowed and moved to prepare another dose. Only then did the Duke look fully at Victoria again. Candlelight caught the blood smeared across her glove cuff and the cut at the base of her thumb where Crystal had bitten. His eyes dropped lower to the dark stains spreading through her slipper from the heel already flayed raw, then rose back to her face. "You are hurt." She tightened the knot on Julian's bandage and kept her voice even. "He is 6. For a moment neither spoke. Rain whispered overhead. The orchestra, muffled through 2 doors and a wall of palms, began the opening bars of the last waltz. The sound was distant enough to feel unreal. Thornfield reached to the table beside the basin, took the remaining strip of linen and held it out. "Your hand." "It can wait." "It has waited long enough." The command was quiet. Harder for that. She gave him her hand because argument would waste breath and because Julian had finally relaxed against the cushions Maddox had brought, his breaths no longer clawing. The Duke wrapped her palm with surprising precision, not gentle, not rough, each turn exact. His fingers were warm despite the rain. When he tied the knot, he did not release her at once. "You stood in that ballroom for 3 hours," he said, voice low. "Wet hem, torn glove, bleeding shoe, no one moved." Heat rose along her throat at the blunt inventory. He had seen. While dancing every eligible woman in Bath, he had seen. She withdrew her hand carefully. "Your Grace has made a study of the room." "I make a study of what threatens mine." The words were shaped like possession and sounded like warning. She should have flinched. Instead, she looked at Julian, at the softened line of the child's mouth now that pain had ebbed, and answered with the first truth that mattered. "Then keep him from Lady Marworth's temper. She sent me here for a clasp. She did not send anyone for him." Thornfield's jaw set like stone. "Did she?" It was not a question. He stood in one controlled movement and seemed to fill the corridor when he turned toward Maddox. "You will carry Master Julian to the blue withdrawing room. No music, 2 footmen at the door. Admit only Dr. Hale and Miss Schmidt." Maddox blinked. "Miss Schmidt, Your Grace?" Thornfield did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You heard me." Maddox bowed so fast water sloshed in the basin, then lifted Julian with careful arms. The boy stirred, reached once toward Victoria's sleeve, and she touched his shoulder until his eyes closed again. Dr. Hale followed with his bag. The door opened. Warmth from the inner hall spilled in, along with brighter music and the hum of a room that had no idea what had happened 1 corridor away. He remained motionless in the doorway until Julian had gone. His face turned just enough that the candlelight struck one hard plane of cheek and left the rest in shadow. When the door shut, they were alone in the winter gallery except for rain, glass, and the scent of wet wool. Thornfield faced her, water still dripping from his coat hem onto the tile. "Where is the clasp?" She held his gaze. "I have not found it. He dropped something in the panic, but I found only broken glass." His eyes narrowed, calculating. "Then it is still here. Or tangled in someone's lace on the ballroom floor." "Come with me," he said. "Now." She heard the final waltz swell beyond the wall, bright and merciless, and knew that when they stepped back into that light, nothing in Lady Marworth's carefully ordered evening would remain under her control. He did not offer his arm. He opened the door and waited 1 measured second, as if granting her the choice to refuse and knowing she would not take it. Victoria stepped through first. Warm air struck her face like a hand. Music poured down the corridor, bright and orderly, indifferent to the wet hem clinging to her calves and the ache in her heel. Thornfield followed, close enough that she felt the heat of him through soaked muslin, and together they entered the edge of the ballroom where candlelight erased evidence and rank restored itself. No one bowed to her. Everyone bowed to him. He did not slow for greetings. He crossed 2 lines of dancers and halted near a pillar where the shadow from an enormous palm left half his face in darkness. "Find the clasp," he said. "Speak to no one of Julian." She kept her eyes on the floor pattern, black and white marble blurring under fatigue. "I would not make a child's fear into entertainment, Your Grace." His gaze settled on her, sharp and unreadable. "Good." Then he turned away and was claimed at once by a Viscountess with silver leaves stitched into her sleeves. He gave her a bow, precise as a blade, and took his place for the waltz as if nothing had occurred in the glass corridor, as if he had not knelt in pooled rainwater with his coat spread dark around him and tied a bandage around a servant girl's hand. The orchestra struck the first full phrase. Couples moved. Victoria stood still long enough to steady the burn in her chest, then slipped along the wall toward Lady Marworth's circle. Her fingers curled around her reticule. Her injured thumb throbbed beneath clean linen. She scanned necklines, wrists, bodices, fan ribbons. Diamonds flashed at every turn. Any one of them might have been Clara's clasp. Anyone might have become a lie by dawn if Lady Marworth needed it to be. Lady Marworth saw her almost at once. Silk rustled, fan lifted, smile arranged. "Miss Schmidt," she said in a voice pitched for neighbouring ears, "you have recovered your talent for vanishing. Have you recovered my daughter's property as well?" Victoria stopped at proper distance. "I am searching." "You were instructed to return with it." Lady Marworth's smile did not shift. Her eyes did. "Mr. Penry's future hangs on your competence." Two matrons turned their heads with mild curiosity and then pretended not to listen. Victoria inclined her head. "I understand." She moved on before Lady Marworth could pin her there with another sentence, and as she passed behind Clara, she saw it. Not at Clara's throat, not on the floor, but caught in a snag of black chantilly lace at Lady Marworth's left cuff. The diamond spray hooked through one torn thread where the fan handle had frayed the edge. The clasp glittered each time Lady Marworth gestured, hidden in plain sight by movement and confidence. Victoria did not reach for it. Not there. Not yet. The floor carried her away with the current of servants and guests. She crossed near the musicians, turned through the card-room arch and paused in the shadow beside a marble bust to breathe once. Her heart hammered against her ribs with clean, hard force. Lady Marworth had sent her into the winter garden for a theft that had never occurred. Either she had not known where the clasp was, or she had known exactly and sent Victoria anyway to fail. Both possibilities led to the same place. A footman hurried past with folded blankets and nearly collided with her. "Pardon, miss." He did not stop. "Where are those bound?" "The blue withdrawing room, by the Duke's order." "Julian!" She turned and followed him through the side passage without asking permission from anyone. By 1:45 the doors of the blue withdrawing room had been shut against music, and the thick curtains drawn to muffle both draught and sound. The room smelled of warmed wool, beeswax, and medicinal tincture. A coal fire had been lit in haste. It hissed once where rainwater had fallen from a coat, hem onto the grate. Julian lay curled on a chaise under two blankets, cheeks still pale, lashes dark against skin too thin for comfort. Dr. Hale stood at a side table, measuring drops into a spoon. Maddox guarded the door with the rigid expression of a man determined never again to look surprised in his employer's house. Julian stirred as Victoria entered. His hand, wrapped in linen, twitched against the coverlet. His breathing caught on the inhale, not as violently as before, but enough to tighten her throat. "Miss," Dr. Hale said, glancing up. "Good. He knows your voice." She stepped to the chaise and crouched so she was level with the child's face. "You are safe," she said softly. "No glass, no cold." His eyes opened fully, unfocused at first, then fixed on her. "Do not go." The words were barely air. They struck harder than any command Lady Marworth had ever issued. "I am here," she answered. "Breathe with me again." She rested 2 fingers lightly at his wrist and counted the pulse as she had counted cargo tallies long ago, steady, exact. No room for panic in the numbers themselves. Dr. Hale offered the spoon. Julian made a face and swallowed anyway. She dampened a cloth in warm water and held it near his mouth so the air he drew was less sharp. After 3 cycles, his shoulders lowered. After 5, the tight line between his brows eased. At the door, Maddox shifted and straightened. The Duke entered without announcement. He had removed his wet greatcoat. His evening coat was immaculate again. Black wool uncreased, white cravat retied. Only his hair, still darkened at the temples, betrayed the rain. He took in the room in one glance and stopped when he saw Julian's hand in hers. He said nothing. Dr. Hale gave a brief report in practical terms, then withdrew to mix another draught, leaving an interval of quiet that felt larger than the room. Julian looked past Victoria and saw his uncle. "Did I break it?" "No," Thornfield said. "You frightened us. That is all." The boy's lower lip trembled. "Aunt Clara said men do not wheeze." A muscle moved along the Duke's jaw. "Aunt Clara is wrong." Julian nodded once, exhausted by the effort, and turned his face back toward Victoria's shoulder, as if that settled the matter. She felt the child's breath warm through wet fabric, felt the trust in the movement, uncalculated and absolute. It frightened her more than accusation ever had. Trust created obligations no one could dismiss with silk politeness. She began counting again under her breath, this time in German because the rhythm was the one her father had used when storms battered the windows and she had been too young to sleep through thunder. 1, 2, 3, 4. Julian repeated the numbers, slurred by medicine, and smiled faintly when he reached the 4th. She did not notice she had switched languages until Dr. Hale looked up and then down again with professional tact. Thornfield remained near the mantel, one hand braced on the carved stone, eyes fixed on the child and on her, as still as if movement might break something fragile in the air. When Julian drifted towards sleep, she eased her hand from his and tucked the blanket closer around his shoulder. "Doctor," Hale murmured approval and began writing instructions for the night nurse. Victoria rose slowly. Pain flared from heel to knee, and she steadied herself on the chair back. The Duke crossed the room in 2 strides. "Sit! I can stand." "That was not a request." His voice was low, not loud, not harsh. The same tone he had used with footmen and physicians and everyone else who might disobey him. Yet this time the command landed differently, edged with something she could not afford to name. She sat on the nearest chair because arguing would wake Julian. Thornfield crouched before her, close enough that she caught the scent of rain and starch and faint tobacco from some earlier hour. He looked at her left slipper, at the darkened leather where blood had dried and fresh wet had seeped through. "Take it off." "No." His gaze lifted to her face. Winter-cold eyes. No patience. "Miss Schmidt." "Your nephew is sleeping," she whispered. "Do not begin a battle over my shoe." For one suspended heartbeat, she thought he would insist. Then his mouth shifted, the smallest movement at one corner. Not warmth, not amusement, but something adjacent to both. Not quite a smile. He stood instead and turned to Maddox. "Bring linen strips and salve." Maddox vanished. Victoria kept her hands folded in her lap to hide the shake in them. "Your Grace, if Lady Marworth learns I am absent from the ballroom, she will learn what I permit her to learn. She does not need truth to dismiss a man who has served this city for 30 years. That stopped him. He looked back at her. All attention narrowed. "Penry! Yes! She threatened him to compel your compliance. She threatens him to compel my silence. Dr. Hale pretended deep interest in his vials. Thornfield's voice dropped another degree. Silence? About what? Victoria hesitated. The answer in full would open doors she had spent years learning how to keep closed until she had proof. Yet the night was already splintering along lines she had not chosen, and half-truths had never protected anyone she cared for. About accounts, she said, about money that should not have vanished. His expression did not change. His focus intensified. You have records? Fragments? Where? Safe enough for now. Maddox returned with a tray. Thornfield took the salve himself, set it on the side table, and looked at her slipper again, as if it were an insult personally offered. You will remove it. She gave him the smallest nod she could make without surrendering the room. Her fingers fumbled at the ribbon. He did not reach to assist. He waited, rigid and deliberate, while she worked it free and drew the shoe off in one controlled motion that still sent pain bright up her leg. The skin at her heel was raw, blistered and split where wet leather had chafed for hours. She expected disgust. She expected impatience. He only said, "Linen." Maddox handed him the strip. Thornfield knelt and wrapped the dressing with the same unornamented precision he had used on her hand. No flourish, no false gentleness. The touch of his fingers was careful, because carelessness would have hurt, and he had decided, with the blunt efficiency of a man used to command, that she would not be hurt further on his watch if he could prevent it. Julian stirred. Victoria glanced toward the chaise. The boy had not fully woken, but his breathing had roughened with the shift in room sounds. She rose despite the Duke's unfinished knot and crossed back to him, one shoe in hand, one foot in stocking on cold parquet. She sat on the edge of the chaise and resumed the count under her breath, palm light against the blanket over his ribs. The rhythm steadied him again within moments. Behind her she heard the Duke stand and then stop. The room held. She did not know how long she remained like that, counting and reciting small harbour facts her father had once given her to calm storms into numbers. 3 bells marks half an hour. A cargo ledger must be balanced by candle end. Rope swells in rain and shrinks in sun. Nonsense to most children. Anchor points to this one. Julian's mouth softened at the edges. Sleep took him cleanly at last. When she looked up, Thornfield was in the doorway, not leaving, simply watching with his hand on the frame, as if he had meant to depart and found he could not. Dr. Hale closed his case. He will rest if the room remains quiet. He will have quiet, Thornfield said. A knock sounded once. Maddox opened the door a hand's breadth. A housemaid curtsied and spoke from the hall. Lady Marworth requests Miss Schmidt at once. She says the final waltz is underway and Miss Schmidt has delayed her long enough. Victoria felt her spine straighten before thought could intervene. Of course, Lady Marworth would not lose control of the evening without immediate retaliation. Maddox looked toward the Duke for instruction. Thornfield did not look away from Victoria. Tell Lady Marworth Miss Schmidt is attending my household. The maid blanched. Yes, Your Grace. She retreated. Victoria rose carefully, set the spare blanket higher over Julian's shoulder, and reached for her second shoe. Leave it, Thornfield said. You are not returning to that floor tonight. She met his gaze. If I do not return, she dismisses Penry before dawn and claims insubordination as cause. I cannot spend his livelihood to purchase my comfort. Penry will keep his place. She will still believe she may threaten any weaker person in reach. She will still do it. His eyes hardened with a recognition that looked uncomfortably like respect. What are you asking, Miss Schmidt? She took one breath. Permission to answer her in public. Silence followed. Fire snapped in the grate. Julian slept between them, small and motionless under wool. Dr. Hale stood very still beside his case, as if he understood he was witnessing a negotiation no witness should interrupt. At length Thornfield spoke. "You will not stand alone." "I have stood alone for years." "Not tonight." The words entered her like cold water and lit something dangerous in return. She bent, drew on the bandaged slipper with care, and straightened to her full height, slight beside him, but unbent. "Then walk where they can see you, Your Grace, and do not speak until I do." For the first time since the winter corridor, surprise crossed his face clear as lightning over dark water. It vanished quickly. What remained was steadier, heavier, and far more unsettling. He opened the door and stepped aside for her to pass into the corridor first. "Very well," he said, when they moved back toward the ballroom. The music of the last waltz swelled through the walls, and Lady Marworth's voice carried above it from the far end of the passage, sharp with triumph she had not yet earned. Lady Marworth rounded the corridor bend with Clara and Anne at her shoulders like polished mirrors, blue silk sweeping the tiles, pearls hard in the lamplight. She stopped when she saw the Duke beside Victoria. For one fractional beat her expression emptied. Then courtesy snapped back into place so quickly it seemed mechanical. "Your Grace," she said, dipping with measured grace. "How fortunate! My stepdaughter has misplaced herself again. I was just retrieving her." Victoria felt Thornfield's presence shift, not forward, not back, simply set. The movement was slight. It altered the corridor like a bar dropped across a door. "Miss Schmidt is with me," he said. Lady Marworth's smile thinned at the edges. "I fear there has been a misunderstanding. She is family and under my care." "Your care," Thornfield repeated, as if testing the weight of the phrase and finding it wanting. His gaze moved once over Lady Marworth's cuff, where black lace trembled with each breath. "I observed your care." Clara gave a small laugh, aimed at no one and everyone. "Surely this is not about a servant's delay. We are missing the final set." Victoria kept her spine straight and her hands still, though her heel pulsed inside the fresh dressing. Thornfield did not look at Clara. "Silence," he said. The word was not loud. It landed like a slap. Clara's mouth closed. From the ballroom the waltz rose and turned, bright strings over soft percussion. The sound of a room pretending order. A footman carrying champagne slowed, saw the grouping in the corridor, then retreated without being dismissed. Lady Marworth lifted her chin another degree. "Your Grace, if this concerns the missing clasp, I assure you we are handling it privately. Miss Schmidt has always been prone to confusion when overtired." Victoria felt heat climb her throat. She opened her mouth. "Do not," Thornfield said, still watching Lady Marworth. The command was aimed at Victoria and shaped like protection. "You have spoken enough for one night in rooms that refuse to hear." The words struck harder than reprimand. He had seen the whole evening, not the polished version presented to patrons and mothers, but the corridor one, the pillar one, the one with bleeding shoes and empty plates. She kept her gaze level and swallowed the answer that had risen to her tongue. Lady Marworth's fan clicked open and shut. "If she has been dramatic, I apologise on her behalf. Grief over old circumstances has made her difficult." "Liar!" The single syllable cut the corridor cleanly in two. Lady Marworth's eyes flashed. Thornfield stepped one pace closer. Candlelight caught the hard line of his jaw and the rain-dark strand of hair still lying at his temple. "You sent her into a freezing gallery while your household did not notice a child collapsing 20 yards from your music. You threatened an old servant's livelihood to compel obedience. You call that management." He tilted his head very slightly. "I call it neglect." Anne made a soft sound of outrage. "How dare—" He turned his face toward her, and whatever she saw there silenced her as thoroughly as her sister had been silenced. "The question," he said, "is mine." The lower hall clock struck midnight, each bell travelling up the stairwell and through the open doors like iron dropped into water. Lady Marworth recovered first. She was practised in recovering. "Your Grace is distressed because Master Julian took a fright. We all regret it. But Miss Schmidt is not suited to your household concerns. She has a tendency to exaggerate injuries, to invite sympathy." Thornfield reached out, not to Victoria but to Lady Marworth's wrist. 2 fingers. No force beyond what was necessary. He lifted the edge of black lace and revealed the diamond clasp, snagged in its torn thread, glittering like trapped ice. No one moved. Lady Marworth's colour drained, then flooded back, blotched high on her cheeks. "That proves nothing. It must have caught there while we searched. I was trying to protect my daughter from embarrassment by accusing Miss Schmidt in advance of theft. I made no such accusation. You made it to 3 ladies by the card room at 11:40. His voice stayed even. "I was standing behind the palm to your left." Victoria stared at him. He had been there, watching, hearing, not intervening then. Intervening now. Lady Marworth's breath shortened. "If your Grace has chosen to indulge a dependent girl's resentments, I cannot prevent it. But you will not insult my family in a passage like common traders." Thornfield let the lace fall. "Then we will use the ballroom." He turned to Victoria. For the first time since Lady Marworth appeared, his expression altered when it met her face. The cold did not disappear. It focused. "Walk with me." She felt every eye in the corridor fix on her before she moved. "Your Grace, if this becomes spectacle, Penry may still—" "Penry keeps his post." He did not blink. "I sent Maddox to the stables 10 minutes ago with that order in writing and my seal." She had no answer prepared for relief when it arrived without warning. It weakened her knees for one breath. She steadied. Lady Marworth stepped into their path. "Miss Schmidt, return to me at once." Victoria looked at the woman who had rationed her food, counted her candles, sold her father by increments, and called it duty. She heard the waltz turning, and the rustle of silk, and the rain against high windows. She heard Julian's hoarse whisper in the blue withdrawing room, "Do not go." "I'm not lost, Lady Marworth," she said quietly. "You do not retrieve me." Lady Marworth's hand shot out and caught her wrist. Thornfield's voice dropped to something colder than anger. "Remove your hand from Miss Schmidt." Lady Marworth held on one instant longer, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because power often believes itself permanent. Then she released. They entered the ballroom together. The floor was nearly full for the closing turn. Chandeliers burned low, candles guttering in long silver branches, wax scent heavy over perfume and warmed wine. Conversation faltered as people recognized the Duke and then recognized the woman beside him in the plain grey dress with one wet hem and no jewels at all. The faltering spread outward in rings. A laugh stopped midway across the room. A violin line wavered, recovered. Thornfield did not take her to the edge. He stopped in open view near the centre aisle where petitions were impossible and witnesses unavoidable. His steward, Mr. Ellery, stood not far off with account papers tucked under one arm. Thornfield gave him one look only. Ellery vanished toward the side doors at once. Victoria kept her hands clasped before her to hide their tremor. "What have you done? What was required?" "That answer is not precise enough." A flicker passed at one corner of his mouth, gone before it could become warmth. "No, it is not." Lady Marworth advanced through the thinning crowd, Clara and Anne trailing like banners after a commander who had misjudged the field. "Your Grace, this has gone too far. Release Miss Schmidt to her family. You are compromising her." He faced Lady Marworth without shifting his stance. "She was compromised when you made her walk through rain beside your carriage. She was compromised when you fed guests and left her unfed. She was compromised when she bled through her shoes while you called her ungrateful." The room held its breath. Victoria felt the words like blows and shelter at once. He named each thing she had taught herself to carry invisibly. Not softened, not omitted, named. Lady Marworth's voice sharpened. "You speak on hearsay." "I speak on observation." His gaze cut to Victoria's gloved hands. Her knuckles were split at 9. Her left heel bled through leather at 10. Her supper was denied at 10:30 while she carried your wine. He returned to Lady Marworth. At 11 you threatened Penry. At 20 minutes to 12 you sent her into the Winter Gallery alone. He had watched the hours. He had marked them as she had marked cargo tallies, exact and cold. Something in her chest gave way at that precision, not to tears, never that in this room, but to a dangerous sense of being seen where she had hidden for survival. Lady Marworth tried a different register, softer and more poisonous. "Miss Schmidt has always cultivated martyrdom. Ask anyone. She invents slights when gentlemen fail to notice her. Even now she uses your concern to elevate herself." Victoria stepped forward before she could reconsider the cost. "I do not need to invent numbers." Silence shifted. Heads turned toward her. She opened her reticule with careful fingers and withdrew a folded page, creased at the corners from being hidden and carried, and read at night by stolen candlelight. "This is a copied ledger line from my father's settlement account. Dowry funds transferred under your signature to a holding agent who does not exist in Bath Registry. I have dates for 3 additional entries." Clara laughed, brittle. "A copied page proves forgery by the copier." "Which is why," Thornfield said, "we will hear sworn books." A stir at the doorway. "Mr." Ellery reappeared with a grey-haired magistrate in evening coat, spectacles low on his nose, expression already irritated at being summoned from cards, and then alert when he saw who had summoned him. "Sir Alton," Thornfield said, inclining his head the bare minimum courtesy required. "You are asked to witness a dispute concerning financial misappropriation and false accusation of theft in this assembly." Sir Alton's gaze moved over Lady Marworth, Victoria, the clasp glittering still at the torn lace, then back to Thornfield. "Do you make this request formally, Your Grace?" "Oh, I do." Lady Marworth took one step backward. "This is absurd. In front of everyone." Sir Alton's voice was dry as paper. "Madame, fraud has never required privacy to operate. It can survive examination, if innocent." A murmur rolled through the nearest cluster of guests, quickly smothered as propriety battled appetite. Thornfield looked to Victoria, not touching her, not rescuing her from the necessity of her own voice. "Miss Schmidt, state what you wish entered." Her pulse hammered. Her mouth was dry. She heard her father as clearly as if he stood at her shoulder, in his ink-stained cuffs. "If the sum is wrong once, accident, wrong twice, fraud." "Enter," she said. "That Lady Marworth threatened dismissal of Mr. Penry to compel me to retrieve a clasp she claimed was lost, though it was found attached to her own cuff. Enter that I have maintained copies of estate entries since Michaelmas 3 years ago because original books were removed from my access. Enter that I request those books be produced." Sir Alton nodded, already signalling to his clerk across the room. Lady Marworth's composure fractured. "You ungrateful little—" "Enough," Thornfield said. The word ended her. He turned to the steward. "Send for Penry and for the coachman who brought the Broad Street consignments. Bring the maroon dispatch box from Marworth House study if it has not yet left. If it has left, stop it." Ellery bowed and moved, boots quick over polished wood. Victoria drew breath that shook once and steadied. "You knew about the dispatch box?" "I saw 2 footmen loading it while you were in the blue room." "I asked where it was bound?" His eyes held hers. "I asked because you taught me to ask." She stared. "I taught you nothing. You taught me in the Winter Gallery that delay costs lives." His voice lowered, meant for her and no one else, though the room strained to hear. "I do not intend to be late again." The line settled between them with the weight of vow. Not polite concern, not passing gallantry, a decision. Sir Alton cleared his throat, practical and unsentimental. "Lady Marworth, you will remain available for statement. Miss Schmidt, you will provide your copies to my clerk. Your Grace, I presume you stand guarantor for immediate document security." "I do!" Clara reached for her mother's sleeve, whispering fiercely. Anne had gone pale enough that powder could not conceal it. The orchestra had faltered into silence without anyone giving the order. Dancers stood in awkward pairs along the edge of the floor, suspended between scandal and etiquette. No one wished to be first to move. Thornfield looked once around the room, measured the staring faces, and then looked back at Victoria. The hard planes of him had not softened. The stillness had. It was the stillness of a man holding ground he had chosen at cost to himself. His hand came up between them, palm open. "Miss Schmidt," he said, each syllable distinct in the hush, "I ask for the last one." Her throat tightened. This was not rescue now. This was declaration in the only language the room respected, public choice. She placed her hand in his. "Very well, Your Grace." He drew her into the waltz as the musicians, after a startled cue from the conductor, found the line again. They moved through the first turn beneath chandeliers, and witness and rain tapping the windows high above. His hand at her waist was steady, not possessive, guarding. She felt the floor through one bandaged heel and one damp slipper, felt every gaze like weather against her skin, and for the first time in that room she did not stand as if unseen. The waltz carried them in a slow turning line through a ring of people who had forgotten, for one astonished minute, how to pretend. Victoria felt every change in pressure from his hand at her waist, every careful adjustment that kept weight off her bandaged heel, without making a spectacle of mercy. Thornfield did not look toward the watching mothers, or the men already calculating alliances in their heads. He looked only at her face, as if the room had narrowed to one task, and he meant to complete it exactly. "Do not favour the left foot," he said under the music. "If I do not, I shall tread on yours." "Then tread. Keep the count." The command steadied her more than reassurance would have done. She followed the turn, then the backward glide, breath matching the rise and fall of strings. Around them, the chandeliers trembled faintly in the draught each time an outer door opened. Rain moved against the high panes in thin silver lines. Lady Marworth stood near Sir Alton now, pale and rigid, one hand at her torn cuff where the clasp had been removed by the magistrate's clerk and wrapped in a square of paper bearing the assembly seal. When the final chord fell, no one clapped. The silence lasted long enough to feel deliberate. Sir Alton stepped onto the edge of the floor and spoke with the dry authority of a man accustomed to ending dinners. "Lady Marworth, Miss Schmidt, Your Grace, this inquiry proceeds at once in the card room. Mr. Ellery has secured the dispatch box and halted the Broad Street consignment. Witnesses are present." Lady Marworth made one last effort at hauteur. "At midnight." "At midnight," Sir Alton said. "Fraud does not improve by morning." The card room smelled of extinguished candles and damp wool. Green baize tables had been pushed aside to make space for a writing desk, where the clerk sat with 2 ledgers open and sand ready for signatures. Mr. Ellery stood near the door, composed and unsmiling. Beside him waited Mr. Penry, hat in both hands, and the younger footman from the loading door, boots still marked with courtyard mud. Against the wall rested the intercepted crate from Marworth House, lid pried back. Victoria saw the gilt frame first, then her father's painted shoulder beneath canvas wrapping, and had to grip the chair back to keep from reaching for it before permission was given. Sir Alton held out his hand. "Miss Schmidt, your copied page." She placed it in his palm. He passed it to the clerk, who aligned the handwriting against entries in the maroon dispatch ledger Ellery had produced from the halted cart. Pages turned, dates were read aloud, amounts were repeated once, then again, to remove any claim of mishearing. "Transfer to C. Hensley Holding Agent," the clerk read. Sir Alton looked over his spectacles. "No such registered agent in Bath, Bristol or London district records under that spelling. Mr. Ellery." Ellery placed a folded docket on the table. "I sent a rider to the registry office when your Grace ordered the stop. Returned within the hour. Negative in all ledgers." Lady Marworth's fan trembled for the first time. "A clerical abbreviation." "Perfectly common." Victoria heard her own voice answer, calm and precise. "Then where did the money settle, Lady Marworth? The receiving column is blank in all 4 entries." No answer came. Mr. Penry was sworn next. He did not embellish, he did not dramatise. He stated that Lady Marworth had ordered him dismissed by dawn, if Miss Schmidt returned from the Winter Gallery without the clasp. He stated that he had also received instruction 2 days prior to prepare obsolete household pieces for sale on Broad Street, including a portrait formerly in Mr. Schmidt's study. The young footman confirmed the loading and destination. The clerk recorded both statements in full. Sir Alton nodded toward the paper packet containing the clasp. "And this item was recovered from Lady Marworth's lace in the ballroom before witnesses." Clara rose half out of her chair. "It caught there by accident." Sir Alton did not look at her. "Then accident has unusual timing, Miss Marworth." He signed one order, then a second. "Pending formal hearing, the Marworth estate books relevant to Miss Schmidt's settlement are seized to neutral custody. Lady Marworth will not remove or destroy papers under penalty. Mr. Penry remains employed under temporary protection of the court. The intercepted goods, including the portrait, return to Miss Schmidt until title review concludes." The words were procedural. Their effect was seismic. Lady Marworth stood very straight as 2 assembly officers stepped to either side of her, not touching, only indicating the door. She looked once at Victoria with naked hatred stripped of silk. "You think this is victory?" Victoria met her gaze without lowering her own. "No, it is accounting." Lady Marworth left. Clara followed in stunned silence. Anne was crying quietly before she reached the corridor. None of them looked back. By the morning of the 3rd day, rain had cleared from Bath and left the stones washed pale under a thin autumn sun. Victoria sat in the solicitor's chambers opposite Mr. Halford, the same man who had once sorted her life into recoverable and unrecoverable piles, and watched him slide a fresh deed across the desk. The maroon dispatch ledger lay beside it, now marked with court ribbons and annotations in 3 different hands. "Read line 7, he said. She did. Settlement principal and accrued interest restored to Miss Victoria Schmidt, sole control, free of intermediary authority. Line 12. Study effects and portrait inventory returned as personal property. Her fingers paused over the signature space. Ink smelled sharp and clean. Through the window she could see the Abbey Tower and a strip of bright sky where storm had been. Thornfield stood at the mantel, coat dark, posture military even at rest. He had attended every interview since midnight at the assembly rooms and spoken only when necessary. Now he stepped forward and placed one additional folio beside the deed. "Before you sign this," she opened it, "guardianship provisions for Julian. Not transfer of affection into law, but protections drafted against negligence, against isolation, against the easy cruelty of households that called harm discipline, supervision rights, medical directives, named access for the child to specific rooms, tutors and attendants. At the bottom, a blank line for her hand as advisory co-guardian in matters of education and health." She looked up. "You said nothing of this. You said he should not be left where fear is called weakness." His gaze did not waver. "I agreed." Mr. Halford cleared his throat, pretending to adjust his spectacles. "The clauses are sound, Miss Schmidt. Unusual, but sound." She sat. "Line by line, then." They worked for 2 hours. She amended a phrase on nighttime nurse rotation. He accepted. He narrowed language on discretionary travel. She accepted. She added a requirement that any guardian may be challenged by petition if a physician records repeated respiratory neglect. He looked at her for a long beat and nodded once. At last, both signed. When the sand had been shaken over the final page, Thornfield pushed the document gently toward her. "Keep that copy with your father's ledgers," she answered before caution could soften it. "I intend to." He inclined his head. Not quite a smile. "Good." At St. George's, Hanover Square, the winter light was clear and unforgiving, the kind that revealed every thread in black wool and every crease in white gloves. The church was not crowded by half the ton, only by those who could be called witness without being called spectacle. Mr. Penry upright in his best coat, Mrs. Davies with red eyes and a fierce mouth, Dr. Hale with Julian beside him in a navy jacket, Sir Alton stern as carved oak, Mr. Ellery holding papers even now as if legality were a sacrament. Victoria wore ivory silk cut plain, no borrowed lace, no lavender perfume, no ornament except the small silver watch key her father had once carried, now on a ribbon at her wrist. At the chancel rail, Thornfield stood broad-shouldered and still, winter-dark hair brushed back, face set in the same hard lines she had first seen in rain and glass and fear. The rector spoke the vows. She answered clearly. So did he. When it came time for his own words beyond the liturgy, he turned not to her first, but to the small gathering behind them, voice carrying to the last pew. "Hear me. She will not stand unseen in any room where I stand." Then he looked at her. The cold in his face had not vanished. It had changed shape. "Nor in any room where I do not." The ring was simple gold, warm from his hand when it settled against hers. Julian, solemn with the importance of his office, offered the registry book to her with both palms, as if bearing fragile cargo. She signed Victoria Schmidt Thornfield in one steady line, and felt no theft in the new name, only addition. Afterward, in the entrance hall of Ashbourne House in Bath, the crate from Broad Street stood open for the final time. Thornfield lifted her father's portrait himself and held it while the footman set hooks in the library wall above the long ledger table. When the canvas settled into place, dust shaken free, Mr. Schmidt's painted gaze returned to the room where accounts would now be written openly. Victoria stepped back beside her husband and Julian, whose bandaged hand had healed to a thin pale mark across the palm. She touched the silver watch key at her wrist. The house was warm, the fire was laid, no door was locked against her. Outside, rain began again, soft on stone, and inside the library Thornfield placed a fresh ledger before her and said, "Begin where they altered the sum." She opened to the first clean page. dipped her pen and wrote the date in a hand that did not shake.